Well, I guess what they say is true, that you either die a hero or you live long enough to see yourself become the villain. And yes, the irony is not lost on me. On this very channel, I talk about how your camera doesn't really matter and that you can save a bunch of money on landscape photography gear and you can use your phone to take professional quality images. Meanwhile, I'm standing here with so many cameras that I actually can't use the ones hanging around my neck. You know, I don't really know how I got here, but I'm hoping that I can get help soon. In the meantime, I thought I would answer some questions that I get pretty often in the comments, which is, do you need a bigger sensor? Do the megapixels matter? And can you get the same images out of different camera brands? And most importantly, can you just make the images you want to make with the camera that you have? Well, I'm going to try to use my powers for good rather than evil today and put those questions to the test. Meanwhile, I'm going to walk around looking like, well, this. And thankfully, there's not really anyone around here to see me. Well, except for all you guys, which is, okay, well, that's unfortunate, but here we go. I'm beginning to realize how dumb this idea might have been to try to do 5 cameras at once, but we're giving it a shot. All pun intended. Shoot. 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 Okay. We took a shot. Well, we took 5 shots. They're probably all... This might be the most ridiculous thing I've ever done.
All right, so we're back inside. I'm actually at my aunt's house, dog sitting, and it's been a couple weeks since I've taken these images, which is actually really good because I kind of forgot what they look like for the most part. But I want to get a few things out of the way. One is a disclaimer for this video is that the Canon R7, the Canon R5, and the X100VI I bought with my own money. The Hasselblad was sent to me in collaboration for this video, but it has nothing to do with the current video that you're watching right now. And lastly, the Nikon Z8 was sent to me by today's sponsor, MPB, but they have no affiliation with Nikon. They'll sell you any brand camera, they'll buy any brand camera. They're just a place where you can buy and sell your used camera gear. So they have no affiliation with Nikon. That means that I'm gonna just say whatever I want about any of these cameras with complete freedom. The next thing is, this is not going to be a raw comparison. We are gonna look at some of these images straight out of camera, but if you're just here to look for pixel depth, dynamic range, megapixels, it's the Hasselblad. That is the sports car of this event in terms of image quality. If you want the fastest thing, it's the Hasselblad. But there's a lot more to cameras than just megapixels and dynamic range. And that is what we're gonna talk about today. The reality is you don't need 100 megapixels or even 50 megapixels to take images professionally and have them printed large, print them in magazines, or anything of that nature. However, I can't tell you what you need. You might be the type of shooter that really, really wants the most megapixels or the highest dynamic range or the fastest FPS, and that is gonna be up to you. But for this video, I wanna talk about things that please me. And I wanna see if I can get away with taking my own images professionally with any of these cameras and just see how they work in relation to each other, see how their colors render, and not necessarily see how much detail each camera takes. Because at the end of the day, all of these images are high quality enough to get away with what I need.
10-second timer, go, go, go. And shoot, and shoot.
Now before we just look at these side by side, even though you're already looking at them, a few things to keep in mind is that the Hasselblad is on a 4:3 sensor, whereas all the other ratios of these cameras is 3:2. So for example, if I were to open up this Hasselblad image, you're gonna see that it is already cropped. I did this when I took the image, so I didn't add this crop in editing. Another thing to keep in mind is that the Hasselblad is at 30mm because that's the lens that I have for it. All the other cameras are at 35mm because, for example, the Fuji has a fixed lens and it's at a 35mm equivalent. Most importantly, I have set the camera manufacturer color profile for all of these cameras to standard. This is not something I normally do in Lightroom. Normally I'm using their Adobe Lightroom's color profiles, but in this particular case, I've gone through and I have gone and edited and added the color profile for each camera. What that means is if you're in Lightroom and you go to browse, it'll bring up a list of color profiles under camera match. And I've gone through and selected standard for all of them. So for the Nikon, it is standard. For the Canon's standard, and specifically for the Fuji, it is going to be the ProVia standard profile. That is because ProVia is technically their standard profile. However, you can select any of these in the camera or in Lightroom and get completely different looks. I think it's really important to remember this because I'm about to talk about what the camera looks like or what the colors are straight out of camera, but a lot of this nuance can be fixed or changed based on the color profile. Let me show you what I'm talking about. So the first thing you're gonna notice when you're looking at all these side by side is the Fuji camera, for example, definitely has more of a red cast. I think that's pretty obvious. You'll see that the Nikon definitely looks a little bit more green. But something else you're probably noticing besides color cast is there's slight variations to exposure. Now, this probably just happened in the field because, once again,
this might in fact be the dumbest thing I've ever done in my photography YouTube career.
But also, specifically on the Hasselblad, it metered differently. So to make this even closer in comparison, what I'm gonna do is I'm just gonna right click on the Nikon image with all of them selected. I'm gonna go to Develop Settings and go to Match Exposures. You're gonna notice that the R7 image gets a little bit brighter and the Hasselblad image gets a little bit darker. And now we're kind of working with all in the same playing field, but now we have a much deeper comparison here. And what's interesting is the R5 and the R7 look pretty dang close. There's a tiny bit more of a magenta cast, I think, on the R7, but that could be caused by the fact that I'm shooting on a Sigma lens on the R7, I'm shooting on a Canon lens on the R5. I think the most telling and obvious ones that you're seeing and I'm seeing is that the Fuji, far more magenta. The Nikon definitely has more of a green tint. You'll also notice that in the Hasselblad, there's probably slightly more dynamic range appearing, but again, that could come down to the profile you're using. For example, if I go into the Nikon image, go to Develop, and change its profile to Nikon's flat profile, you'll see that it's gonna lose a lot of contrast just based on the profile that I select. And I think it's important to remember that because we talk a lot about straight out of camera color science and color profiles, but from my eye, there's obviously a difference between these images, but not so much of a difference that you couldn't get it to where you want it, which is what we're about to find out next. I'm gonna sit here and edit these images the way that I would normally edit my image to see if I can get it to a point that I like it, and then we'll take a look in the same exact way and see what they come out like. But first, let me sit here and edit some of these images. I'm going to start with the Nikon image. All right, I think I'm pretty happy with this edit. I kept it pretty light because I really just wanted this image to have a almost film-like look, just a very light feeling where it kind of had a glow to it. It just felt like a nostalgic image. So that means things like raising the blacks up so that there is nothing in black and kind of adding a bit of glow with removing some clarity. And I kept things pretty simple. I didn't add a bunch of masks. I think for the most part, the only mask I may have added was just a very light sky mask for some of them or graduated filter. But that's something to keep in mind is that this particular image didn't call for a ton of editing. And in reality, actually, the camera that's most suitable for the image that I'm going for here is probably the Fuji, just because that particular camera and its profiles do a good job at the look that I'm going for naturally straight out of camera. So I'll be interested to see which one you prefer out of the 5 images on the screen. And if you can't see them out well, I'm gonna have an article linked down below where you can see these galleries in much higher resolution. So I'll be curious to know which one you prefer out of these images, but you're probably wondering which one I prefer. Honestly, I haven't sat down enough and just looked at these to figure out which I prefer the most. But I think the final image here, I really like the way the tones in the Nikon are. So what I mean by tones is the areas in the highlights here and how the highlights are playing off in comparison to the shadows, even though the contrast and stuff in most of these images is relatively the same. You'll notice that the dark areas in the bottom are all roughly the same amount of dark. However, the differences in the highlights, between the highlights and the darks in the Nikon image, in this particular edit, I tend to prefer. Other little things you'll notice is take a look at the sky areas and how it renders the colors blue different depending on which camera it is. I actually think the Hasselblad is probably the most blue, but also I did change the white balance in some of these to try to get them closer to what I was looking for. But I noticed more of a blue cast in the Hasselblad, especially in the shadow areas. So all of the hazy areas over here on the horizon and stuff like that, It just definitely gives me more of a blue hue and probably just slightly more saturation in the blues on the Hasselblad. But to be completely honest, looking at these 5 images, you have to really nitpick between the 5. And I genuinely think on a different day, I might pick a different image out of my preferences when I look at these. And I think that that's really what this comes down to, is that there's so much flexibility in the images and in your edit that you can get away with pretty much anything you want to from any camera.
We got another shot with some movement this time probably, and the sun was kissing the tops of this brush here as it was also hitting the top of that butte back there. Nice little scene, simple, easy, and I can set all of these up and take the same image, which is highly important. Okay, before we jump into the straight out of camera comparison, I actually do end up editing these images contrary to what I'm about to tell you, and I try to match them as best as possible to each other. So I thought it would be fun to see if you can guess which camera is which in these images. I'm gonna have the answers at the end of the video, but once again, if you wanna see them in higher resolution, be sure to check out the link in the description.
So really quick, let's look at a few of the other images. I'm not gonna go into as much depth with these. I have not edited these. However, I've once again set the color profiles to all the camera match color profiles, and I've set the white balance to be the same white balance throughout. One big caveat for this image and the other images we're gonna look at is I made a small mistake out in the field.
Once again, this might be the most ridiculous thing I've ever done. And if you're enjoying the most ridiculous thing I've ever done, maybe consider liking the video or subscribing if you're into this kind of ridiculous content. What have I become?
This did not happen for the first test, and thankfully that is great because that's also the best image. But normally I keep this filter on the front of this lens. And what that filter does is it's a splash guard filter so that nothing hurts the front element on this particular lens. Normally that stays on there. It was not on there for the first test. However, when I went to put it on there, when I realized it wasn't, I grabbed the wrong thing and I accidentally grabbed a glow filter, this particular filter, and put it on there. And as you can probably guess, that created some glow in the image and thus ended up making the Canon R5 image have a bit of a glow to it. So if you zoom in here and you compare it to the R7 image, you're gonna notice that there's definitely a hazy glow that has a bit of warmth to it on the R5 image. However, I don't think it necessarily hurts the comparison here. It's definitely gonna add more of a warmer cast to it. But now you can actually see what it's doing between the R5 image and what it's doing between the R7 image, because if you remember, those two images are very, very similar. Something to note here is that we're seeing the same patterns again. The Nikon image definitely has more of a green tint. The Fuji image, definitely more of a magenta. I mean, just look at the color rendition difference in the planes area at the bottom of both images. One is vastly more green than the other. I'll say the Canons probably lie somewhere in between those two. I actually think the Canon image is actually closer to the Hasselblad in terms of color. Like if we look at the Canon R7 image and we zoom in to this little pillar over here, and then we go back and we look at the pillar on the Hasselblad, these actually look very similar in terms of how they're rendering that color. Another thing to notice is the blue in the sky and how it renders that color. You'll see in both Canon images, it's almost like a flat gray. Like there's barely any blue in the sky in both of those images, whereas the Nikon image and the Hasselblad image have quite a bit of blue in their sky. At the end of the day, I think that you can see consistency in how each of these cameras is rendering color and detail and shadow. And for the most part, a lot of it comes down to what your personal preference might be. So out of all of these images, before editing them, I think I actually prefer the Fuji image. And it's not because of the resolution or the shadow detail or anything. It's just, I like the red color cast that Provia is giving on their standard color profile more than the duller looking images out of the other cameras. I will say both Canon images are probably the flattest with their profile, whereas the Nikon has a bit more contrast, the Hasselblad has some contrast. But again, you'll also notice that the Hasselblad looks just a tiny bit underexposed, and that's because of that thing I was talking about in the field, where the Hasselblad seems to meter slightly differently. But these are such small differences between these that they're all things that you could just do in the edit if you wanted to. It's just your starting point could be slightly different based on the camera you're working with. All right, so looking at the last images, once again, Nikon in the top left, Canon R5, Canon R7, Fuji X100VI in the Hasselblad. We'll see the same things over and over again. The white balance has already been set for all of these, but noticed how red the cast is once again on the Fuji, but also how blue the cast is on the Hasselblad. When you look at those side by side, they obviously look like they have a ton of differences, but when you try to compare the Hasselblad to say even the Canon image or the Nikon image, it's clouds. Like look at the way the blue is rendered in the clouds. There's way more saturation there. Other things to look for is the tonality in the sky between the clouds and the horizon line, and that gradient of pink down to blue. You're also gonna see that is far more saturated in the Hasselblad image. All right, so looking at these images and trying to figure out which one I think I prefer, it's probably the Hasselblad pre-edit, just because I like the color tones on the mountain a little bit better, and I like the color tones in the sky just a little bit better. But I also think that a lot of that's just coming down to the fact that it's a slightly more blue than the rest of them, and that would be something that's probably pretty easy to fix quite quickly in the edit. And I think that there's a repeated pattern probably going on here, is that the one that I choose is possibly not the one that you choose or that someone else has chosen. And I think that at the end of the day, I hope you realize that, no matter what you pick, you can get away with a really high quality image, regardless if it's a $1,000 camera or $10,000 camera. Now, maybe you watch this and always preferred the Hasselblad. That might say you should get the Hasselblad. You might have watched this and said, I liked one of the Canon images the best. And honestly, that's a pretty great place to be in life, where right now it doesn't really matter what camera you can get. You can probably get away with anything, whether it's $1,000 or $10,000. But after watching this video, you might have preferred a certain quality from one of the cameras highlighted within the video, yet you're sitting at home without that camera or that brand. Well, firstly, I'm sorry I did that to you. But let's say you did want to transition. Well, today's sponsor, MPB, makes such a transition easy and seamless. You can get a quote for whatever gear you own right now instantly right on their website. If you're satisfied with that quote, MPB will handle the rest by sending someone right to your doorstep or allowing you to drop it off at your leisure. You don't even need to print the label. After they receive your gear, they'll confirm the condition from the quote and pay you very quickly. The process is much easier than trying to handle things privately, plus there's never a concern about getting paid. If you're simply looking at grabbing something to add to your camera bag, MPB can save you thousands of dollars while also having a plethora of choices. The Nikon Z8 and lenses I received literally came in the original box and look brand new while costing much less. Plus, every piece of gear you purchase from MPB comes with a free 6-month warranty and has been reviewed by an expert before being listed. So if you're looking to sell, buy, or trade into a new system, MPB can do it all while making it much easier for you. Thanks again, MPB, for supporting this channel and sponsoring this video. And once again, these images will be linked down below in an article where you can look at them in more detail than just right here on this YouTube video. And I hope this was insightful. If it was, consider liking the video, consider subscribing if this is kind of the crazy content that you want to see more of. Although I don't think I'll ever do a 5 comparison camera thing again, but who knows. Anyways, thanks for being here. It's got to be around out there somewhere. We just got to go find them. Later.